And we are live. Welcome, everyone, to the Storycraft Cafe. I'm your host, Hank Garner, and today I am super excited to have Taylor Brown with me. Taylor has a brand new novel which releases next week. It's called Wingwalkers. I have so many questions about this book and about your process today, Taylor. Taylor Brown grew up on the Georgia coast. His work has appeared in a wide range of publications, including the New York Times, the Rumpus, Garden and Gun, Chautauqua, the North Carolina Literary Review, and many others. He's the recipient of a Montana Prize in Fiction, a three-time finalist for the Southern Book Prize, and was named the 2021 Georgia Author of the Year. What a great what an immense honor that had to be.
That was
He's al-
pretty good. Yeah.
He's also been a finalist for numerous awards. He's the author of a short story collection in the Season of Blood and Gold, as well as five novels: Fallen Land, The River of Kings, Gods of Howell Mountain, Pride of Eden, and his brand new book, Wing Walkers, which releases on Tuesday of next week. Taylor, an Eagle Scout, graduated from the University of Georgia in 2005. He settled in Savannah, Georgia, after long stints in Buenos Aires, San Francisco, and the mountains and coast of North Carolina. He's the editor in chief of bikebound.com, and he likes old motorcycles, thunderstorms, and dogs with beards. And honestly, who doesn't love dogs with beards? I mean,
True.
come on.
True.
Right. Taylor, after all of that glowing introduction, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Hank.
I'm excited to have you. Taylor, we've been I've had this question that I've asked various people as we get our conversation started over the last few weeks, and this has been a fun thing, and it's always fun to hear people's answers. Um, what is a piece of writing advice that you have received from someone, and maybe it's a good piece of writing advice, and you think back and oh, this is something I'm going to use, or maybe it was a horrible piece of advice, and you look back and you say, man, I'm so glad I didn't do that, or I wish I wouldn't have, lived by that piece of advice. Do
Right.
you have anything that comes to mind?
I've probably tried to forget all the bad ones as best I can. The one that I kind of live by and go back to a lot comes from Georgia writer Harry Crews, who said, "Put your ass on the chair," is the way he put it. I think of it as just get in the chair. I've heard it
Yeah.
come in both ways, but that was something that Harry said. That didn't matter, how talented you were, what education you had, what mentorship you had, what anybody in a workshop said, anything. All that mattered, what mattered most was that you got in that chair and wrote, and that's how you got better, and that's how anything ever got done. So I've kind of lived by that mantra for a long time and continue to do so, and that really is my, I would say, foundational mantra.
Well, and that leads to another piece of advice that we hear touted a lot, and it's been attributed to a number of people that I've heard over the years, is that it's easier to edit a bad page than a blank page.
Absolutely.
And that comes from putting your butt in the chair, and
Yep.
it has to come from doing the work, and if you don't do the work in some form or fashion, then nothing comes of it. But so I love that. That's fantastic. Um, Taylor, have you ever gotten a piece of bad advice that you look back on and say that had nothing to do with writing or publishing, and maybe some things that stick out that are um kind of that get reiterated more and more, that just really don't have anything to do with anything?
That's a really good question. For me personally, not a whole lot. A lot of people are big on doing some kind of I think it's just it's part of it is finding what works for you. So I can't think of any advice that I think is just bad, bar none, categorically, right?
Yeah.
I know that there are things that don't work for me, right? Like doing character sketches or a lot of outlining, that's never really worked well for me. Every time I try to do that, um, I just end up with a story or characters that seem kind of wooden. It takes the life out of it. I say that it would make my life a lot easier sometimes if I outlined, my book, so I knew exactly
Yeah.
where we're going the whole time. On the other hand, I know really successful authors that live by that outline, and
Right.
that they can't even conceive of getting a book done without that outline, and they write amazing books. So, it's not bad advice for them. But every time someone, especially early on, kind of pushed me to do that, it didn't come out the way that I wanted it to.
Well, speaking of that, because, as writers, we love to place ourselves and everyone around us in one of two camps. They're either plotters or they're pantsers. And you
Right.
you either plot out everything ahead of time or you write by the seat of your pants. Um, what I've discovered is that most people are some variation of a mix of the two.
Right.
I, for one, um, I like to write a story first to kind of discover my characters and to discover the world that they're living in, and then after I've kind of written by the seat of my pants to kind of figure those things out, then the story starts to unfold for me and I can write down kind of what I see are upcoming plot points and things that I can write toward. But I start off as kind of a pantser, that I don't know anything and I don't know enough to plan yet. But as I do, it starts kind of unlocking. Or do you find yourself like you say that you're a pantser, but are you a true pantser?
I don't know that I'm a true pantser. I would say that it really stuck out to me when you said you write a story first, because
Yeah.
a number of my novels have started with a short story. Now, I didn't do that on purpose. I just wrote the
Right.
short story and then realized that there was more here, or that I wasn't finished with the story. And that has been, honestly, Fallen Land started with a short story, my first novel. And I actually used that short story as the first chapter of the book. I decided to just keep going. I had read that Ron Rashid did that with a story called Speckled Trout, which he
Mhm.
just built into A World Made Straight. And so I thought, well, hell, I'm going to try the same thing. This kind of has a similar type ending to the story where the character is in a pickle, and let me see if I can get him out of this. Right.
Yeah.
And so I just kept going. And then The River of Kings started with a short story. Gods of Howell Mountain and Wingwalkers did not, but Pride of Eden started with a short story. And so I do feel like, one, I love short stories. I don't write them as much as I used to. I used to, that was really my apprenticeship, was writing short stories,
Mhm.
submitting them, trying to get them published. Um, but I have found that that is an amazing way to really discover your characters. And a short story typically, is always, you're a pantser with it, right? A lot of the time,
Right.
I mean, most of the short story writers I know, you don't really know where they're going. You don't have to,
Right.
because you only have, 10 or 15 pages. Or if you know where you're going, you probably don't know what's going to happen, where you start or what's going to happen in between, right? So I have found that that is a really good way to flesh out a lot of big parts of a book.
Speaking of short stories, one of my favorite writers of all time is Ray Bradbury,
Mhm.
and he was adamant that new writers especially should write short stories, and he said, write a new story every week,
Mhm.
and for a year, and at the end of it, surely you can't write 50 bad stories,
Right. Yeah.
which is kind of tongue in cheek, but it also speaks to the fact that sometimes just doing the work over and over again makes you better. How do you feel about the form of the short story versus the form of the novel?
I'll say two things. One, I really agree with what he's saying with just doing it. I have
Yeah,
always thought that, like a lot of things, you just get better from doing it. I mean, it's sheer
right.
force of will and discipline, to some degree. You just get better from doing it, like most things. So I definitely believe in that. I love short stories, but I have found that I struggled a little bit more than I expected to with the step from. I tried to I tried to take how I wrote short stories and write a book that way a couple of different times, to
Yeah,
have that level of compression that a short story has to have that level of every single sentence standing out. And it did not translate as well to the longer form. The longer form just has to be a little bit looser to me. And you exhaust someone with that level of intensity that a short story someone sometimes has if you try to do it for 300 pages. So I
right.
did find it harder to transfer from my having a primary focus on short stories, which I did at one time, to having more of a primary focus on novels. It wasn't as fast of a transition. That said, I mean, I love short stories. I still think they're the way to go, the way to start. It's a way to get your name out there too. It's a way to discover all kinds of different characters. And honestly, when we're starting out, usually most of us, I know me, I mean, I wasn't very good. So,
Yeah.
you know, you can get a lot of short stories done and how, you know,
Yeah.
like saying, you know, and have some ones that aren't good, and it's okay. It doesn't take as much time as spending years on a book that's not good, which I also did a couple times, and maybe you have to do that sometimes too. But so I think that there's something to be said for that part of it.
Yeah. Um, One thing that I love to hear people talk about is um, this idea of a sense of place and how place affects the stories that you tell. You were born in Georgia. You live in Georgia now, but you've lived all over the world in the intervening
Mm-hmm.
years. But there's something about the Georgia soil that has kind of seeped into who you are and your soul as a storyteller, if you will. And your book Wingwalkers, you know, when it deals with William Faulkner, who, you know, I'm from Mississippi. William Faulkner is a huge hero in Mississippi literature and you know, literature in general, but you know we hold pretty tightly to William Faulkner,
Yeah.
and you know that sense of place comes through in that. How do you feel like you, as a Georgia storyteller specifically, maybe a Southern storyteller in general, how does that come out in your work?
I think that there's certainly something about the landscape, and I certainly speak. You know, lived a long time in San Francisco in my 20s, and I've really never said anything out there. It just didn't, for some reason, it didn't speak to me the way that home did. You know,
Yeah.
and I think that there is something about you know, that we always talk about Southern writers, and do people want to be called Southern writers, and why aren't Northern writers called Northern writers, and you know,
Right.
all these things that are actually kind of
Oh
fun
yeah.
to talk about. But you know, to me, the South, one, there's the landscape. You tend to, unless you're out west. I mean, a lot of places have more rural, but there is a
Yeah.
lot of rural landscape still around in the South. And then there are just so many interesting dichotomies and contrasts and all those things in the South, whether it be, you know, rural versus urban, or, you know, just, you know, racial tensions, history, the sense of people gripping on to certain parts of the past, and then other parts, you know, really looking to the future. So I think there's something about, you know, that just the South seems like such a melting pot of all these different things that it continues to draw me back to it. And then the
Yeah.
landscape itself, I mean, I think it is partly too, you know, it's just what I know largely and what I've grown up around. I do find myself drawn back to, um, you know, I grew up largely on the coast. And my novel Gods of Howell Mountain was set in the mountains in North Carolina. And, you know, I couldn't have done that if I hadn't gone and lived there for a while to be able to do it. So I usually do feel like I have to have spent a good amount of time, you know, somewhere to be able to capture it like I want to.
Gotcha. Speaking of Southern storytellers, because that is a genre or a designation or whatever that does get made, and we never talk about New England writers
Right.
or maybe Midwestern writers some. But what is it that makes a Southern writer other than, you know, having your toes in the soil, you know, at some point? What what designates what makes these stories have a life of their own?
That's a good question. I mean, I think that there's so many different ways to define that and look at it. I mean, you can say that anyone that is writing something that's set in the South or is from the South could somehow, you know, be a Southern writer. I do think that when you think of stories that seem especially Southern, there seems to be a focus on the way people speak. If you think of like everyone from Flannery O'Connor, Larry Brown, Eudora Welty, they had such an ear for the way people speak, and there are so many different accents in the South. You know, of course, if you're from outside of the
Mhm.
South, you think that everyone sounds like Texas baby or something. Doesn't even
Right.
South, or sounds like some Mississippi accent that hasn't existed in 100 years, right?
Right, right,
But it is, there are so many little accents within the South, within every state, and within every section of every state. I think that Southern writers tend to have a really good ear for that. There tends to be lots of times a focus on some of the things that have just stayed so important in the South, like, religion and family, the past versus the present, an agricultural past versus in a more urban industrial future, the clash of those things that we've, really saw in the last, 100 years or so. So
right,
I think all of those elements are certainly, part of it. There's that whole Gothic thing, the whole, so many Southern writers, whether it's, Faulkner, Flannery O'Connor, have this Gothic element, this, their
right,
characters almost grotesque. That, or people think that, and then you just, live in Savannah for for a few weeks, and Flannery O'Connor's characters might not seem so crazy, right? So,
right.
all
Exactly.
of that might be part and parcel of it.
Yeah. Um, uh, Taylor, there's something magic that happens around storytelling, and it's one of those intangible things that's hard to describe, and you can't quite put your finger on it. But at one moment in time, nothing about wing walkers existed in any form or fashion. It didn't exist.
Mhm.
And then you either stumble on some little weird historical fact or something, or maybe a character walks onto the stage of your mind, and then you're like, who is this character? And then they start speaking, and you've got to know more about them, and or something happens and it triggers something, and then in some form or fashion wing walkers does exist, and then it's your job as the writer to excavate that story and to dig it out and to know these characters. And it's a weird magic. I don't know how else to explain it, but storytelling is I don't know how to explain it. What is that first moment of creation like for you? And is it different for, this is your fifth novel.
Mhm.
Has it been different every time? Does it begin similarly, or kind of talk about that moment of creation?
The You used a couple words that I just have to say I love, like excavating it, because it always has felt to me, a lot of the time when I'm working on something, it feels like I'm uncovering something that's already there. And it's
Right.
almost just my job to do the best job I can of excavating it, something I've discovered, underneath the surface. It's like the bones of a dinosaur. And it's my job to, find out where all the other pieces are and how it all
Yeah.
goes together, and trying to take those pieces where that are unclear, covered, and try to assemble it or something. So it's this weird, you're totally right. There's this weird magic in the way that things just seem to come together. You just
Yeah.
trust, especially if you're a pantser and you don't do a lot of outlining, you just trust that it all comes together, and it somehow does. For me, I would say that that point of origin is not always the same necessarily. I trace it back with Wingwalkers to I kind of go back to one moment that really is a seminal moment for me, which took place in Mississippi, in Square Books in Oxford.
In Oxford, yeah.
Yep, I was there in 2016 for the Oxford Conference for the book. It was my first ever book tour for Fallen Land. I was in this kind of strange state because I gotten sick
Mhm.
on my night up there. I'd been on tour and I got food poisoning. And then I
Mm.
barely made it through my event at the Oxford Conference for the book. And then the next day I finally felt better, but I was in this weird kind of like post fever glow.
Yeah.
And I had a few days off, so it was kind of like, but everything just seemed lighter. I don't know. It's just so strange, but I seem kind of out of it. Anyways, I'm just hanging out in Square Books. It's my first time there. And for anyone who doesn't know, the walls are just covered in all this kind of
Oh,
literary
yeah.
memorabilia. And I saw on the staircase landing, I haven't been back in a couple years. I'm sure it's still there, but there's a shadow box and it has a picture of Faulkner in it. But it's
Mhm.
not the Faulkner that we're used to seeing with, the pipe and someone who looks like they won the Nobel Prize. He's
Right.
really young. He looks like he's just out of his teens. He's wearing his RAF uniform. He's got, his flying cap cocked on bold. He's got his rattan cane. He's got a cigarette sticking out the corner of his mouth. And there were some other items in there. There was like a striped regimental tie and some RAF wings and a sketch of a World War I biplane done in his hand. And that is the moment for me that really started Wingwalkers, because a couple things happened. One, it gigged my memory, because I remembered that in a lot of Faulkner's early work, there was a lot of just aerial aviation. There were pilots, there were fighter pilots, stunt pilots, barnstormers, test pilots, all this stuff. Flags in the Dust, Last Stardust had that, a bunch of the short stories. And it kind of brought that up because I was always interested in that aspect. And then also for me, I grew up, my dad was a pilot, and I grew up loving airplanes. I say that I was a waffle belly growing up, because you go to the airport and you'd watch the airplanes take off and land, and you lean against the fence, and if you do it long enough, it imprints itself on the the chain.
That's so funny. Yeah.
And so I just wanted to know more about this part of Faulkner's life, so I started just digging in, looking at biographies, memoirs from his brothers and family members, and it was just one thing after another where I felt like I was almost uncovering buried treasure, because I hadn't, there were just all these stories. The book starts based on a true story, when this every year at the fair that they would have down on the square in Oxford, they would have what they called the Balloonatic would come, which this guy had a homemade hot air balloon. I mean, we're talking like 1908, right? And he pumped it up with a coal oil fire, and then he would go up in it, and then he would parachute out of it with a homemade parachute. It's not like you could buy a homemade parachute in 1908. And
only in Mississippi.
Yeah, he landed on the Faulkner's hen house and smashed it up when he came down one year. And then their dad almost got, their dad came out with a pistol and everything, right? Because the guy was all cursing, and their mom was in the house hearing him curse, and the hogs were going wild. And so, I just started finding all these stories. And then, of course, Faulkner went off to want to be, he wanted to, during the Great War, he wanted to be a fighter pilot. And so he goes off to join the RAF, and there's all these stories behind it. It's how he added the U to his name, because he thought he needed to be a British citizen. He thought Faulkner with a U in it would look more like he was a British citizen, and he affected an accent, goes off the cadet wing. We think he doesn't he doesn't graduate. The war ends. He probably never soloed there. Comes back to Oxford in an officer's uniform, telling all these stories about his flying exploits, right? And so it's just, I mean, you can't make this stuff up, right? So it was just a wealth, right? And so I just felt like I was onto something, but I wasn't sure what that story was going to be, because I didn't want to just write some, almost nonfiction or fictionalization of Faulkner's life told from perspective. But I had ideas for other characters already cooking. So like Barnstormers had always interested me. And then, so there was that moment when I saw that photo. And then in his biography, there was a second moment. In the Blotner biography of Faulkner, which is kind of like the big definitive one, chapter 36, I found out that he went to the opening of the Shushan Airport in New Orleans in 1934, which was this big to-do. Thought it was going to be a new air hub of the Americas. It was during Mardi Gras. And that was like Conquest of the Air was the theme for Mardi Gras. And in his biography, he didn't come home one night. And then he shows up the next morning, hungover, and he tells this tale of hanging out with this husband and wife barnstormers all night. And we don't know what he did with them and what that tale was. He just told this tale over breakfast, this wild tale of spending the night with them. And there's no other information about it. So I decided to reimagine who they were and how their lives, intersected with Faulkner's at that time. So that was really the creation process of the novel.
So when I first saw the novel and I started reading about it, and then started reading through the arc, I was really intrigued. And historical fiction is really having a heyday right now. And one thing that I really wanted to ask you was, we have real people in this book, people that we can point to, and we know all sorts of things about these people, William Faulkner especially. There's lots and lots published about Faulkner, and he's not an unknown entity.
Right.
And this is a time period that is also not an unknown entity. We know lots and lots about this time period. How do you take a real life person that we know all sorts of things about, and place them in a real life um, setting that we know a lot about, and then write fiction around that. What are some of the boundaries that you set for yourself to write about these real people in real times and real places, but then allow your imagination to allow you to novelize these real places? And I guess what separates um, historical fiction from alternate history?
It's a good question. I think that to a large degree, these aren't things that I, during the writing process itself, it's interesting to talk about, it's interesting to talk about it now, but during the writing process itself, so much of it is done in some ways intuitively. So much of it is done like I wouldn't do it unless I felt right doing it when I tried doing it,
Mhm.
right? Unless I felt drawn to it and I felt somehow in some way that's hard to articulate that I was, although I know that I'm not telling the truth, so to speak, with the capital
Yeah,
T, that I am not, transcribing all these moments in Faulkner's life. These may not be the exact thoughts he had. It felt right to me in a way that's hard for me um, to validate, to
yeah,
bring any evidence for why it would or why I would feel that way. All I know that is if I didn't feel that way, it wouldn't have gotten written. I literally wouldn't have been able to do it. Right. I
right.
have found this interest. It started for me with my book, The River of Kings, has an artist in it, this French artist, Jacques Lemoyne, who was the first European artist in what will become North America. He was French. In a lot of his paintings, either survived or he redid after he got back to France. And he was the first, I think, real life character that I put into a book and told things kind of from their perspective. Um, and it fascinated me. Now, there's much less known about him than Faulkner. We're talking about someone who's a celebrity versus someone who's an unknown. But it did make me interested in doing it with someone else, someone that
Mhm.
I had always felt a kinship with, which I had felt a kinship with Faulkner just because I had enjoyed his work from an early age. There weren't, there was probably nobody else at my entire school, if not my entire county where I grew up, that felt, that it was liking reading Faulkner when they were 18 years old that much.
Yeah,
Right. Just to be honest.
yeah.
And, and then with the flight, his love of aviation, which I also had, it just felt right to me. There
Hmm.
were just, as I got deeper into his character, I felt like I could do it. And so I did, I didn't, it's interesting because I think since I've done this and talked to some other authors that have done something similar, everyone does it differently. Like my Faulkner, his life as described in the book stays pretty dang close to what I could come across in the biographical record, right? So it's kind of like you hear the story that might be one sentence, right? Or it might just be if
Hmm.
I could take that one sentence and make it a whole scene. Or there might be one scene in some, like in a memoir from his brother or in his
Sure.
biography, this, of something that happened. And then I could blow that up into a whole chapter or multiple chapters. And I think what separates it too is that you are getting inside you're getting inside their head, which biography does to some degree. Creative nonfiction does to some degree, but you're doing it a lot more. Um, but I did really try to stay true to somehow capture the spirit of who he seemed to me at these times in his life. That isn't to say that it's right, but it was right for me at the time and it felt right. And I also did want, if Faulkner was able to read it, to get a kick out of it too.
Yeah,
I didn't
yeah,
want to
for
do
sure.
something that was like disrespectful or something like that because I do, revere him. And there was
But he
kind of,
was the character,
yeah, he
and
was a
yeah,
character,
that's got to come out.
little rascal, and people
Yeah,
don't realize that. And
yeah,
I loved all the modernists, right? Like I started reading all these modernists at a formative time in my life, Hemingway and Virginia Woolf and stuff. And a lot of the male modernists were kind of, I mean, they were jerks, right?
right,
From
right,
and Faulkner, although he told all these tall tales, was kind of a lovable rapscallion, that
right.
no one really realizes that, I don't think. And I think I wanted to communicate that too.
But and I love it. I love it. But does immersing yourself in this person or in this place or whatever your topic is beforehand, does that then give you the freedom when you're writing to not be so worried about the details because you already kind of filled your mind with who they were and um, that you would think that some people might have a hard time that you may break the flow of writing by going to look something, did I get this detail right, and maybe stressing about those. But if you immerse yourself in them ahead of time, does it just kind of give you the freedom to write more freely about it?
I think it's such a balance because if you
Yeah.
overdo it at first, you can't write anything because you know
Mm,
too much that you stop
true.
yourself every time you try to start. And
True.
Nina de Gramont is a friend of mine, and she just wrote or just came out with this book, The Christie Affair, about Agatha Christie. And
Yes.
she tried to do something similar with Emily Dickinson, but she pre-researched it so much that she couldn't do it because she knew too much almost, right? So this time she let herself go in the other direction a little bit. And
Okay.
I think there is some level of, for me, I feel like I'm in sometimes like I have to download a certain amount of information that's like root level information in my brain, like in the Matrix when they have to like learn Kung Fu and they plug in,
Right.
and like 30 seconds later, they're like, and they know how to fly a helicopter or they know, right? So
Right.
there is some level of, obviously it takes longer than that, but like reading and getting this base level of information. But I tend to look stuff up as I'm going along, or I would kind of research all about one aspect and work on that, but not everything of what's going to come all down the line. Right. And then I would go search out what I needed next. It is a balance because I think you can overdo it on the one hand, but you have to have that kind of base knowledge, like you're saying, to be able to do it at all, to have enough
Right.
knowledge to write and not have to stop every single sentence to figure out, what something you don't know, I guess.
Right. The book not only focuses on Faulkner, as we mentioned, but this couple,
Mhm.
these barnstormers and the Wingwalker, where the title of the book comes from. You alternate narratives throughout the book. What was the when did you decide that this needed to have alternating viewpoints? And then as a writer, how do you start structuring out the writing of the different viewpoints and who's gonna give a view into this and who's gonna give a view into that? And can you just talk a little bit about when you start perceiving that uh, that you do need to have different points and how you kind of segment those out?
Absolutely. I think that in this book particularly, I wanted, you'll notice that the Faulkner chapters are shorter, and
Hmm.
I wanted those to kind of be more like glimpses. And because I didn't want to overdo it with Faulkner, I wanted to keep this little bit of magic there with him and not, and just have us more have glimpses. And so the bulk of the book already I knew had to come from the other characters. And I just like the idea of going back and forth, weaving the story as they get closer and closer. One challenge that I had was that in this book, at least, those two storylines, Faulkner does not actually physically cross paths with the other characters until probably three-quarters away through the book. And nor do they stay together for that long. So the two storylines have to be speaking to each other without actually touching, if that makes sense. And
Yeah.
that was something that I first really experimented with in The River of Kings. And The River of Kings has a contemporary storyline, and then there are three storylines, but mainly there's two. There's a contemporary storyline with two brothers on the Altamaha River, and then there's that French artist I was talking about, which is
Hmm.
500 years before that. So those storylines go back and forth, but they're never going to actually touch, right? They're too far apart. And so in that, I had played with this idea of the way to make viewpoints and chapters speak to each other, have let them have echoes, especially the way that one chapter ends and another one starts. So for this book, there would be things like Faulkner, as a lot of young men of his era, when the World War One, or as they called it, the Great War started, they had this very glorified idea of war and what going off to that war.
Right.
Your honor and to die for your country is the sweetest thing and all this. And they didn't realize what a absolute cataclysmic nightmare that war was going to be. And
Sure.
so Faulkner, we really have records of him working on some poems that had this ace in them, right? This ace that was like this glory, like the way the light hits him as he gets up at dawn to
Mhm.
go on his dawn patrol, et cetera, et cetera. And so, for instance, like a chapter would end with Faulkner working on that poem, and then the next chapter would start, and you'd have Zeno, who was a real World War One ace, who's dealing with all kinds of trauma. And the next chapter starts, and here's Zeno throwing up in the morning because he
Right.
drank too much the night before, right? And this is not uncommon for him. Get what I'm saying? And so they
Mhm.
speak to each other pretty clearly, and yet without touching, right? And it is a part in Faulkner's life. Faulkner's first novel Soldier's Pay ends up having that ace from his poetry be this, almost blinded and coming home. And you know what I'm saying? He
Yeah.
goes, Faulkner himself must have, and went through this idea of, all the glory that was not the glory that anyone thought. Right. So, and then here we are with Zeno. That's almost some character like that down 10 years down the line. So, um, but in terms of deciding how I do it, it just felt like the right way to just go back and forth. And if you're going to have both elements in there, they had to, um, you had to keep them pretty close for them to be able to make sense. So you had to kind of go back and forth, is what it felt like to me. Um,
Sure.
but literally, to be honest, I mean, I remember talking to my mom on the phone about it, trying to work it out, in like 2016, being like, "You just listen to me, try to talk this out." And
Right.
she's been listening to me tell stories to her since I was 5, chasing her around the house with my GI Joe. So it was, she,
That's funny.
God bless her, she's
Yeah.
listening.
So, as a someone who is a self-professed pantser,
Mhm.
when your stories have such intricate timelines and the viewpoint switches and things like that, how do you manage what you're writing? A friend of mine who is a diehard plotter, he
Mhm.
says everyone's a plotter. He said you may plot after your first draft, and then take all the pieces that you've written and figure out how they fit together. Or you may do it before you ever start writing, but everyone's going to do the work of a plotter at one point or another. What do you think about that?
I think that's an interesting point, but I would say that, this book would probably speak against that, in that,
Mm,
I mean, sure, when I've gone back through the drafts, you are kind of connecting the dots a little more. You're tightening things up. You are changing the way some things work plot wise to work better. But I didn't restructure the book from the original drafts, completely restructure it. And nor have I really done that much in the past. But I think I'm plotting as I go along. It's just I'm not plotting the whole thing. I'm just
right.
plotting. I know what's going to happen if I'm on a chapter. I have a pretty good idea what's going to happen, in the
Yeah.
next chapter after that. It's like
Yeah.
E.L. Doctorow said, and I go back to this a lot. He said, writing a novel is like driving at night. Um, you can only see 500 feet ahead, but you can get the whole way there. And
Right.
so that's the way that I kind of think of it. Yes, I am plotting. I'm just plotting this much,
Yeah.
at a time, not the whole thing. Um,
Right.
so that probably is what's happening with me, because I do have a pretty good idea as I'm going through what's the next couple steps are,
Yeah.
and then it
Well,
gets
if
vaguer and vaguer as you go farther out, probably.
right, right. And I may know that I'm going to Savannah, but I may not know if I'm going to go through Atlanta or not.
Right.
There there there's lots of options, and
Exactly.
depending on what the journey presents,
Mhm.
may dictate the path that's taken.
And that's
Uh,
fun, partly, right? I mean, when
yeah.
you discover the characters act in ways that you didn't think that they would, which is what real people do, or things happen in the story that you didn't think were
Right.
going to happen, which is how life works. So to
Yeah.
me, that is, helps the story really feel alive, and like it has a beating heart to it.
Right. Taylor, throughout our conversation, you have mentioned other writers quite a bit, and here at the Storycraft Cafe, community is is one of the most important things that a writer needs in his or her life,
Mhm.
for a number of reasons. But what does community mean to you?
I have realized how much it means so much more, honestly, since the pandemic, because I think that I didn't realize how good and how important it is to just be able to talk to and share with other writers because we live a fairly solitary existence. A
Yeah,
lot of people, a lot of people in my that I see every day don't even know that I'm really a writer or have no idea to how seriously I'm doing it, right?
right.
Um, and I think that's true for a lot of writers. We're spread out. The internet and things has helped us to be able to form communities that we didn't have before. But we just had we had the Savannah Book Festival here in February. And that was the first time I've gone to a festival or conference or anything in 2 years. And if you were to ask me before that, do I like going to these things? I would say, yeah. I mean, I like going to them, but I don't like, yes, there's a festival,
Right.
and I felt so dang good after that thing, just getting to talk to some other authors and just to share some of the same challenges, some of the same highs and lows, to commiserate about certain things, to all of that. I realized, God, how much I missed it. And it really
Yeah.
filled up my well in a way that I didn't realize I needed. And I'm so excited. I'm getting to go on book tour for this book because I'm going to get to see, both writer and reader and bookseller friends. That's all the similar type of thing, that,
Yeah.
um, because I'm fairly introverted most of the time, so I don't seek out a whole lot of company in everyday life necessarily. But I think it's so important as a writer to have some sense of community. In the old days, all these writers, they wrote letters to each other, right? Which I think
Yeah.
is a beautiful thing. That I kind of wish we still did, but man, it's hard to sit down and it's hard enough to get enough writing done, right? And then to write
Right.
beautiful letters like they used to,
Yeah.
an email doesn't seem quite the same, but I think that it's really important.
Well, I think that a lot of writers would consider themselves introverts, and uh, maybe people that are not introverted don't understand that it's not that you don't need human interaction at all. It's that you fill your well up, like you said, and then you're able to then sustain yourself on that, and then go back and fill that up. But it's not a daily need necessarily.
Right.
But yeah, I think a lot of people understand that sentiment for sure.
Mhm.
Wingwalkers is your fifth novel, and you've had a short story collection also published. How do you feel like that you have grown and changed as a writer throughout the course of these five novels and short story collections? Do you where you see yourself now? How do you compare that to the writer that wrote that first novel?
That's a good question. I think that I am less. I think that my prose has grown in the sense that I used to put so much into every single line. I was probably almost like I was trying to show off. I wasn't doing that. I was doing it for myself because I love
Right.
language and those kinds of things. But I think I've, streamlined it, cleaned it up, been able to focus on, refocus on the character and the story and the voice of the characters less than the voice of the narrator, if that makes sense.
Sure.
I think that there's something with that. I think that I don't know. I'm not sure in the different ways that I've grown. I guess I don't. I try not to overanalyze myself and my work too much in that way. But I do think that um, the other thing that I found is that I have, you get older, you get a little bit wiser. I found a lot of ways of doing research, and
Mhm.
I know what's going to work for me and what's not down the line. That certain things happening in a story that I might feel pulled towards, I just know isn't going to work somehow or something. I think that you just develop a little bit more of a of that gut instinct, that intuition. I think is
Yeah.
kind of a developed thing for the story and for what it works and what doesn't, and what resonates and what doesn't.
Sure.
Um, just like a more clear-eyed focus on moving toward what burns bright, what resonates, what has meaning, what does that make sense? Versus kind
Absolutely.
of writing and trying to just come across it as you do. Does that make sense? Maybe a
Absolutely.
little bit slower, and I'm not just running through the woods. I'm like walking through the woods more slowly, paying more attention, and I can find, the campfire that I'm looking for better than just, you know,
Right. Right.
find it. Which
Right.
maybe that seems like what I did a little bit more early on.
Yeah. Yeah. Taylor, if we know anything about the publishing industry, it's a bit of a slow burn
Mhm.
sometimes. Wingwalkers comes out this week, in just a few days now, um, meaning that it must have been off of your desk for the better part of a year,
Yep.
probably. So since you turned it in, and now, surely you've been working on something else. What's occupying your imagination these days?
That's so well. It's funny you bring that up because I was just talking. I was up at the bookstore signing some books this morning. We were talking about the same thing, that it's so strange because I finished the first draft of Wingwalkers in 2017, and then it had.
Right.
I shared a quote yesterday with copy edits, and it was really a year ago. So it really has been about a year. It's been
Yeah.
off the desk, and to me that seems like kind of a gift because if it was that new, it would, the criticism and all that, both good critic, both praise and, harsh criticism would both,
Right.
bring you up and down that much more, which can
Yeah.
kind of be tough, when you're going through it. So it gives you like this little bit of, for me, it gives me a little bit of like a psychic buffer zone. So
Yeah.
it's kind of like, whatever happens, I can like not get it all big in my head about it if it's good, and I don't get all down about it because it's bad because I've been occupied with other stuff.
Right.
I don't want to talk too much about what I'm working on because I'm kind of excited about it, and
That's good.
it's one of those stories though that's kind of like out there that someone else might come across, so like a scoop. So I'm kind of,
Yeah.
but I've been working on something for a while now that's set in West Virginia, and
Okay.
with the coal mining background and all that kind of stuff, that I'm really into, and starting to get close on hopefully having a manuscript ready to submit to my editor, and then
Okay.
something besides that, which is a little bit different for me. We did a big trip out west last summer with it. We have an old camper van that we got, and
Nice.
somehow it survived, a big uh, uh, trip out there, and I just always loved it out there. And so I'm kind of got this contemporary, more like almost like a contemporary Western I've been working on, but with a little bit
Nice.
of a not naturalistic, environmental slant to it. Um,
Okay.
Outside of the South, I think that might be, on the one hand, it's like a little bit of a stretch because publishers seem to want you to just, reproduce to some
Oh
degree,
yeah.
something that's not too far off from what worked before. And I'm not really one of those writers that does that. But some of us Southern writers or writers based out of the South complain about having a hard time breaking out of the South. So I figure you got to put your money where your mouth is and set something a little bit farther out if you want to
Yeah.
move farther out.
Absolutely. Well, Wing Walkers releases Tuesday, in just a few days, and it's going to be available in hardcover or Kindle edition or audiobook. Have you listened to the audiobook yet? Have you gotten any pre-release?
But I'm excited. I've had the same. I love my narrator,
Yeah,
Mark Grandma. He has narrated some of my, he did a bunch of Flannery O'Connor stuff, which is where I first discovered him. And
nice.
I forget how it all worked out, but I, asked them to see if he might be interested in doing one of my books, and he was, and that was The River of Kings, and then he's done all of them since then. And so I love audiobooks. I actually listen. That's what I listen to when I'm in the car every morning. I go mountain biking every morning, and that's what I listen to on the way out there and the way back. And the narrator can really make or break a book.
Yes.
If you listen to audiobooks, and there are books that actually I don't even like. I've gone to read the book and I don't like it as much as when the narrator does it, and then there's books that
Right.
I love, and then the narrator's somehow not the right narrator for it, or somehow doesn't seem to do a good job with it. And you're just like, So I'm excited. I mean, honestly, that's one of my, on publication day, one thing that I will do is go listen to part of it, because that's one of the exciting things. Because if I asked, they probably would send me some kind of soundbite, but
Yeah.
I've never asked before. It's kind of like a Christmas present thing, like getting to unwrap that box on the
Yeah.
day of. Does that make sense?
And it makes perfect sense. Perfect sense. Taylor, if people are just discovering you and want to, dig into all the great stuff that you've been up to and dig into your back catalog and all that good stuff, where can they find you online and connect with you and follow along with the journey?
They can check out my website, which is www.taylorbrownfiction.com. I'm on Twitter at Tay Brown, one word, TayBrown. I'm actually most active probably on Instagram. You get all kinds of, back stuff on my life, including bicycles, motorcycles, dogs, and books and all kinds of stuff. That's at Taylor Brown 82.
Well, that's where all the positive vibes are too,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
all the good vibes are on Instagram.
yeah. I don't spend that much time on Twitter or Facebook at all these days. That Instagram is really where I if I'm
Yeah,
online, that's where it usually is these days.
great. Well, Taylor, we're going to send everyone to see you, and Wingwalkers releases this coming Tuesday. Go grab it. I promise you won't be disappointed. Taylor, thank you so much for joining us today in the Storycraft Cafe.
Hank, thanks so much for having me. Really happy to be here, and really appreciate it.